I don't know if we have any heavy metal fans in the audience, but the title of my section is actually a nod to the 1990 album by Anthrax of the same name, which I listened to on the way here to get psyched up, and which we briefly entertained the idea of playing for you and then quickly agreed it was a terrible idea. So moving on, this is the topics that I'm going to be covering today. Obviously, time is the theory, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we see time being linked to ad effectiveness. And then I'm going to go into sort of two growth areas for consumer time spent, really the only two at this point, which are mobile and over-the-top streaming, which will set up nicely our third presentation from Luke and Andrew at Roku. And finally, I'm just going to bring it all together and hopefully end on a happy note for all of us here. So to start, I wanted to talk about what we see as something very important, which is the link between time and ad effectiveness. I put this article up because I noticed it in Media Post a couple of weeks ago. And what struck me about it was essentially the folks at Media Post went through a little exercise to try and figure out, is there a value that we can place on consumers' time in terms of how much of it that they spend with our advertising? And the gist of this sort of opinion piece was that that was a waste of time because there is absolutely no connection between what people do with their time and ad effectiveness. And what struck me about it is that it flies in the face of exactly everything that we've done in ad effectiveness research in-house at MAGNA. So I just wanted to take a minute to kind of go through some of the ways, some of what I mean by that. A few years ago, we started our sort of exploration of viewability and how that impacts ad effectiveness on digital. And what we found was that that time in view was significantly more important than how much of the ad was in view. And that obviously the longer the ad was in view, the more effective it was in terms of recall. And by the way, I'm going to touch on a few studies here, but if any of our subscribers want to dig into the studies themselves, just let me know afterward and we'll make sure that we get those to you. The last time we did a subscriber briefing in the fall, I covered off on one of the recent studies we did on interactive video advertising. And what we found there was that having interactive features within a video ad led to people spending more time with the ad, and by sort of proxy, made the ads more effective in terms of driving those brand metrics that we like to see, like favorability. And then we did a study of actually trying to value how much time people spend with an ad versus what it costs. And we just used a dollar sort of CPM for the purpose of this exercise. But what we found out was that based on the metrics that the exposure time drives, you could actually put a value on whether someone saw half the ad, a quarter of the ad, and so forth. And that very much speaks to what the MRC is trying to do right now with duration-weighted metrics for cross-platform video. So basically valuing impressions by how much time people spend watching the ad. And lastly, we did a study on ad lengths. And at first glance, you can see pretty clearly that in this case, the longer the ad, the better the favorability and so forth was. Now, the caveat here is that these were unskipped ads, so it sort of required that you viewed them to completion. What we did find when we tested shorter ads is that they do work harder if you are comparing them to longer ads that were skipped. So there's a role for both, really, at the end of the day. And so kind of hearkening back to what I was just saying about the MRC, basically one of the things that we've struggled with in the industry at large is cross-platform measurement, how to do it consistently, what sort of metrics do we use. And one of the things that we think is important is time, because it's one of the few constants that we have across platforms. It's one of the few ways we can understand what people are sort of paying attention to by proxy. So thus the name of my presentation today. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about mobile now, and I'm going to kind of dig into a couple of the areas within mobile that people tend to spend the most of their time doing. Just to kind of start off with the high-level view, these are our estimates of time spent by media type all up. And you can see that as of this year, mobile is more than a third of time spent, well more than live TV at this point, which speaks a little bit to the ratings crisis that Vincent mentioned earlier. And we only see that growing over time. So in 5 years from now, it will exceed 40% of our time. And sometimes it can be a little hard to kind of get your head around it, because when you think about your interactions with your phone throughout the day, they're usually pretty quick. But there's a lot of them, and I'm going to get a little bit into that as it pertains to social in a minute. So not too long ago, Nielsen did an exercise where they just look at gross minutes all up among adults and how they were spending their time with mobile. Not surprisingly, social is on top, followed by entertainment for smartphones. Search is in there as well. They bucketed the two together for reasons I'm not entirely sure of, but I think we can safely assume that the bulk of that time is social, just because search interactions tend to be pretty quick, and because the next slide I'm going to show you is going to kind of dimensionalize for you just how much time people are spending with social. So let's start with social. So this is some data from a company called Augury that has a very thorough way of tracking your behavior on phones. Vaguely creepy, if you ask me, but very accurate. And you can see this is just sort of year to date through early April. And Facebook is, without question, still the 800-pound gorilla when it comes to social. So by far the most sessions per user, although their time per session is slightly lower than some of the other social networks. So Snapchat, for example, has a little bit more time spent per session, even though its sessions per user are an order of magnitude lower. And you can see, sort of what the platforms cater to kind of affect how people interact with them. So Pinterest, for example, quite low in terms of the sessions per user, but very high on time per session. And when you think about what people use Pinterest for, inspiration for home projects or recipes and cooking and that kind of thing, it makes sense. Similar for Tumblr, which of course is writing and reading blog posts, so a little bit of a longer engagement when you do engage. So one of the things that I wanted to take a look at, given the recent bad press around Facebook and the hashtag that actually started Delete Facebook, was, are people actually doing that? And the short answer is no. So active users has remained steady. Actually, it's gone up slightly between March and April, and if you recall, the Cambridge Analytica thing broke in mid-March, so you would think that would be when it started to sort of dip if it was going to, and it really hasn't changed. And I don't have it on this chart, but Augury also measures possession of the app, and that has remained unchanged as well. So, obviously, with all the news recently around Facebook and social media, we have to be very careful as agencies and marketers about how we use consumer data to target. But that is to say, we don't see social going anywhere, and we do see that some very good uses for it in terms of ads that are good for consumers. And according to our own research and from our friends at Reprise, there's two things that social seems to do really well. One is location targeting, and the other is a little bit more recent, augmented reality. And this example I have combines a little bit of both. But we were talking about when I showed this slide to the team, is that we don't actually know of an app that actually does this yet. This feels like what Yelp should be, but it's not quite there. So I don't know, I would like to see that. Location, in particular, is a very handy thing. And we, a few years ago, we teamed up with Yahoo to study how personalized ads were received by consumers. And when we sort of used different criteria to target them, to personalize the ads, what we found was that location and social media use were two big drivers of favorability and purchase intent for serving ads on a mobile phone. So that kind of backs up the idea that those two things are key things that I think consumers find useful about receiving ads on their mobile. And lastly, just to kind of get into the AR realm a little bit, one of our clients partnered with Snapchat to do National Unicorn Day lenses for icebreakers. And despite what the gentleman on the left may appear to say, it was very well received because unicorns are awesome and everybody wants to be one. But in all seriousness, icebreakers, it drove a lot of brand awareness for them and some actual sales lift as we were able to measure it. So there is definitely a role for having fun with brands and getting people to spend more time with them that way. And that kind of speaks to the study we did on interactive video ads as well. Okay, so we covered social. Now I'm going to go into the sort of the entertainment side of mobile, which was, as you recall, the other big time spent metric for mobile consumers. I was a little bit surprised. I expected video to be sort of the number one use of time within the entertainment bucket, but it's actually gaming by a pretty significant margin. And I didn't point this out on the first slide that was digging into mobile, but if you look at tablets, the gaming is an even bigger chunk. And video is also a big chunk on tablet just because the bigger screen is really makes it for a superior experience for both gaming and watching videos on the tablet. But of course, smartphones are the more ubiquitous device and the one that's kind of with you throughout the day. So about half of time is spent gaming on smartphones. Makes a lot of sense, given it's a great thing to do when you're waiting in the doctor's office, commuting, easy to pull up a game and play. So we just did a quick look at ranking some of the big games that are popular right now based on time per session. And some of these are really big. I mean, if you look at the Merged Dragons game, which as far as I can tell is a game, the theme of which is breeding different kinds of dragons together to make the ultimate dragon, more than 30 minutes per session. So that's pretty significant. People are spending a lot of time with this stuff, and there's opportunities there to kind of talk to them in an organic way. I don't know how you get in on the dragon action, but that's something we can think through later. So lastly, moving on from gaming to video, which is sort of the third bucket I wanted to dig into for time spent with mobile. What we've seen, this is freewheel data, is that people are watching more live content on their phones. And in this case, because it's freewheel, it's going to be a lot of the NBCU stuff. So Olympics, for example, would be some of the things that people are watching live on their phones, particularly considering the time difference between the Olympics and here. People might want to watch live at odd times of the day when it's not necessarily airing on TV or when they're at work. But it's important to know that short clips are still kind of the bread and butter of smartphone viewing. And we know this because if you look at just strictly PC and mobile time spent with video, YouTube is by far still the dominant force, 60% of overall minutes. One of the things that was interesting on here, in addition to just pointing out the YouTube thing, was Netflix has actually shrunk its share of time on PC and mobile. It's about 4.5% now, and I think that speaks to people preferring to watch it on TV, but also just the growth of Hulu a little bit, because we think people, Hulu being the sort of ultimate catch-up with your favorite shows platform, people are more likely to want to watch that stuff on the go and catch up with their shows so that when it's on later in the week or that night, they can be up to date. So just a few takeaways. One of the things we talk about when we do these presentations is, David's like, I want us to be able to answer the question, so what? So that's the title of the slide. So what? So just recapping what I said, social isn't going anywhere, and we see location and augmented reality within social as two good areas to play in terms for advertisers. Mobile gaming, again, a huge percentage of time within the entertainment bucket, and there are ways to do that really well by tying your brands to particular moments in the game or actually being part of the game if you can. And lastly, there may be more long-form viewing happening on mobile, but short form is still kind of the bread and butter, and you can optimize that experience for the consumer by using shorter ads. As I mentioned, they work harder when you're in a skippable environment and on mobile in particular, and also using a vertical format that takes up the whole screen, and this is kind of the optimal experience for ads on mobile. All right, so I'm going to go into the second big growth area that we are seeing, and that would be over-the-top streaming. And I don't think this is a surprise to anyone.
Brian, hold on a second. I'm sorry. On the mobile front.
Yes.
You were talking about, before you got talking about duration, in-view ads, viewability, percentage, whatnot. How is the correlation of mobile and social with viewability compared to that ad effectiveness?
I mean, I don't know that we have it sort of cut by social in particular, but I think the general finding is the longer something is in view, the better. If you can couple that with targeting using what you like and your location, then I think it kind of ups the ante even more. So this is kind of just a cut of the first chart I showed with all media, cutting it down to kind of get a better look at mobile and OTT as part of the time spent pie. And you can see that although OTT is a smaller share in general, it is set to grow about 60% over the next 5 years. And we see that as an enormous growth area. Question in the back. This would be anything streamed to the television set via a standalone device or a connected TV. So it could be Netflix or anything you're streaming to the TV. So we see growth in 2 areas in terms of how people are connecting their TV sets. Standalone devices like Roku and Amazon Fire remain very popular because it's very easy and relatively inexpensive to make a dumb TV a smart TV in just a few minutes. I think it's still growing because people don't buy TVs as quickly as they would other devices, and it's really a good thing for people who might be just starting out in their own home or kids that are going to college. Very inexpensive way to get that capability on any TV with an HDMI port. We do think that those standalone devices, that ownership is going to start to taper off a little bit as people buy new TVs, because you pretty much can't buy a TV that isn't smart now. And even our friends at Roku tell us that their biggest growth area right now are the TV sets in which their operating system resides. So we'll continue to see that smart TV growth, and those devices will start to kind of level off a little bit. And in terms of the 2 devices I mentioned, Roku and Amazon Fire being the sort of most accessible, it's not surprising that they are the biggest in terms of time spent among those devices. So, and one of the things we point out on this slide is that we noticed within those standalone device universe, we noticed that women 18 to 34 are the biggest consumers of on-demand content. This could be a function of them enjoying the on-demand capabilities. And if you look at sort of TV in a very traditional sense, women do tend to be bigger consumers of TV. But if we're being honest with ourselves, it's probably just because they're smarter. So breaking down smart TVs, internet-connected devices, and video game consoles. So video game consoles, sort of when the OTT phenomenon started, were the kind of the way in for a lot of people, and it was the dominant way to watch video for a while. At this point, it's shrinking in terms of its share of time spent watching streaming to the TV. Internet-connected devices like Roku are stable for now, but the biggest growth area is those smart TVs because, as I mentioned, you really can't buy a new television set doesn't have those capabilities at this point. And obviously, the big bad that we all sort of think about all the time is Netflix, and we wanted to dimensionalize a little bit that viewing for you all. This is data from Nielsen's streaming meter, which captures sort of everything that's streaming to the TV within the home. And Netflix accounts for about half of all streaming to the TV set. But when you put that in the context of all video time, all up, so if you think of the stacked bar that I always show, that I'm going to show in a few minutes, of all the different video platforms, Netflix is only about 8% of viewing time overall. So that doesn't sound so bad. But to kind of wrap everything together, one of the things we're constantly thinking about at MAGNA is how do we navigate this new world, and Luke is going to get more into detail on this, but basically what we found is that we kind of need to simplify the way that we think about it. So if you think about things in kind of 2 buckets, so everything that occurs on the TV set is TV, and everything that occurs elsewhere is not TV. It kind of gives you a very simple paradigm with which to kind of think about how we engage. And obviously, there are tools and technology that are being developed and that are out in the marketplace now that we need to seize on to make the best use of this space. All right, almost done, almost coffee break time. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to bring everything all together using the lens of video. And here's the famous chart that I just referenced before that I always show. This is our estimates of video time all up, how people spend it by platform. And if we think about the 2 big growth areas that I talked about today, mobile and OTT, they're really driving that growth, and they are the reason that in 5 years from now, we think about half of all video time will be streaming in some capacity. So something to think about. And lastly, I just wanted to, like as I said, end on a high note, considering what David talked about and all the sort of uncertainty that we have in our business right now. This was some numbers that Nielsen recently released that looked across all of the platforms that they measure, and they came to the conclusion that people still spend the vast majority of their time with ad-supported content. So good news for us, we all still have jobs for a while. And I will conclude, like Vincent, with a tweet that you are welcome to share. And basically, going to the idea that time is significant, time is money, and if we think about how people spend it, mobile is an extremely important area to think about.